All right. So today I'm going to be talking about online fan fiction for language teaching and learning. So as Sophie had already said, I'm based in the United States, but the work I'm going to be talking about has been carried out in a variety of countries and is actually inspired by things that we see in online fan spaces in the digital wilds. So before I get into that, I'm going to lay a little bit of background down about what I mean about the digital wilds and fan fiction and fans. So to start off with, the digital wilds is a term used to describe the digital spaces, communities, and networks where language learning occurs and that are independent of formal instructional contexts. I know that I personally have been spending a lot of time in the digital wilds during the pandemic because it's one of the few places I can go and hang out when there are a lot of different restrictions in place. But what we see in the digital wilds are a lot of different communities and spaces where people come together to interact, to create things. And we also see language learning happening here. But one of the things, or one of the big communities or different types of communities we see in the digital wilds is referred to as online fandom. And that is the local and international networks of fans that develop around a particular program or text or other media product. So you can see here is a photo from some fans in person. But we've seen quite a few different kinds of fandom spaces that occur around lots of different types of popular franchises. But to back up a little bit, I want to explain what is meant by a fan, because there can be some debate about it. It's not always used in a positive way. But this is the definition that I like. It's one of the definitions that's used in the field of fan studies, which looks at media response behaviors. So here, Duffett says that a fan is a person with a relatively deep, positive emotional conviction about someone or something famous. So you can see an example here of a photo that was taken by a colleague of mine who happens to be a fan of Bruce Springsteen. So you can see it's possible to be a fan of a performer, musicians, bands. We also see fans of politicians, unbelievably. We're also probably very, very familiar with sports fans. That's another big category of fan. But what I'm going to be focusing on here are what are primarily known as media fans. So they would include fans of performers, but also fans of books, movies, television shows, and even games, digital games that we see people taking part in. So to continue with, there's been a fair amount of research in the field of applied linguistics that has looked at language learning through fan practices in the digital wilds. Now, I reviewed some of this in a relatively recent article in the Calico Journal. We see, for example, fans who engage in the consumption of anime or manga to develop their Japanese language skills. There's some research that's gone back a while on that. Earlier research, in fact, one of the earliest studies in the field of applied linguistics, looked at a young fan who became involved in developing a fan website, and through that developed his English proficiency and a new, what we might say, textual identity. Also, because fans are very passionate about the thing that they like, they really enjoy getting into debates about it. So there's also been research that's looked at the language, but also literacy development among fans who are involved in debating or moderating debates in online spaces. More recently, there's been a rich outpouring of research, particularly from our colleagues in Spain, who've looked at a variety of fan translation practices and the various different kinds of identities and language learning practices they engage in as they're translating across multiple languages and developing their plurilingualism. Another fan practice is spoiling. And that's one that maybe a lot of people don't think about, but it's also makes great use of the digital wilds and social media. And that is where fans try to gather and share information about the production or plot line of a television show or movie, for example, before it's been released. So they're trying to guess what's going to happen. But perhaps the most research of these fan practices that are used for language learning in the digital wilds is fan fiction. And so this is what I want to talk about next. So what is fan fiction? It also has a variety of definitions, much like fan does. And this is one that I like by Jameson, who says it's writing that continues, interrupts, reimagines, or just riffs on stories and characters other people have already written about. So you can see there's a transformative element of taking something that exists and making something new, or combining several things and elaborating on it, building on the work of others. So I mentioned there's been a fair amount of research on fan fiction for language learning in the digital wilds in particular. And here I want to share a few examples, just a few. So here we've got a study by Lee, 2012, who was working with, did a case study with a learner named Yin, who was a Hmong refugee to the United States from Thailand. Yin began reading and copying word for word fan fiction because Yin was involved in drawing fan art. So Yin was reading for the purpose of drawing, illustrating. Later, though, she progressed from not just copying, but instead summarizing the stories that she was drawing pictures of. And later, she began writing her own fan fiction. So Yin's reading of fan fiction scaffolded her emergent ability to write two very different kinds of texts in her second language of English. In another case study that I really like, and this is a group case study carried out by Korobkova and Black, they looked to a special community of fans of the band One Direction, who were involved in specifically writing fan fiction about this British boy band, not necessarily in one language. Some were using it in home languages or second languages, but what they all agreed was that the language skills that they developed through writing fan fiction, even though it was meant to be non-school related, it actually transferred to their classroom and their academic writing. So for instance, they recognized the development of both vocabulary and grammar knowledge that was transferable, but also the ability to identify and correct their own errors. And this is a pretty powerful thing to learn. And it's in fact something many writing teachers often work with their students on. How do you recognize and correct your own writing? So they attribute this skill development to happening through fan fiction, even though it was not always intentional. So this leads me to the studies that I want to talk about today. I saw these wonderful things happening in the digital wilds. They inspired me to think, well, what can we do to inspire that same kind of attention and focus in our students in the foreign language classroom? What happens when you actually try and bring fan fiction tasks into the classroom? So the first study I'm going to talk about looks at a project, a 6-year project that brought fan fiction tasks into an advanced English as a foreign language classroom. And for this, we're going to move to Sweden. So the context is in Malmö, Sweden. So we move all the way to the very southern part. You can see down at the bottom of the map here, to Malmö University, to the English Teacher Education Program, which had a course that was required for all students. It was offered in their first year, in their first semester. Now, students entering this course were, of course, training to become secondary and upper secondary English teachers. And in their first semester, of course, we anticipated their level was meant to be around the B2, perhaps to the C1 on the Common European Framework of Reference, so that they had a pretty advanced level. It would get more advanced over time. But this course specifically was designed to introduce them to the ideas of teaching literature and creative writing in their future classes. So we thought bringing fan fiction, which required a lot of creative writing, but also elements of literary analysis, seemed to fit within this course. And we wanted to see how successfully it worked and what would happen. So what I'm going to share with you is some overview of the 6-year project that we carried out in this class. Now, the class itself, because it's a first-year class and it's required, is quite large. We have something like 70 to 90 students each term, which is a lot when you are looking at writing projects. So for this reason, the students were engaged in collaborative fan fiction writing, not individual fan fiction writing. And what we were also doing was basing it on a text that they were going to be analyzing in the course. And the text itself was one that they might use in their future teaching when they went on to teach in secondary or upper secondary school. So the first 2 years of the project, we started with Tolkien's fantasy novel, The Hobbit. Then we switched the next 2 years. We moved, we still stayed in an element in the past, but we moved to Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes stories and had students then writing collaborative mystery fan fiction. And then based on overwhelming student feedback, we then moved to the Harry Potter texts, and we had them doing collaborative fan fiction on the Potter project. So I'm going to share with you some highlights here, but more details about this is explained and elaborated upon in a recent publication I had with Steve Thorne, where we talk about some of the challenges we faced and how we continue to adapt the project every year to make it more like the actual fan fiction experiences in the digital wilds. But what I'm going to focus on today is what happened. What did the students perceive that they learned in this project? And as part of the project, all 6 years, students were responsible for 2 different kinds of writing that they had to do. First was the collaborative fan fiction that they wrote in their groups. So again, as I mentioned, it was a large class. So we formed groups of students of approximately 3 to 6. We didn't have groups larger than 6. And regardless of the task itself, each student was required to write at least 1,000 words. So contribute 1,000 words to their story, which meant over the 6 years, we had stories that ranged in length from about 3,000 words on the short end to one extremely ambitious group who wrote over 16,000 words. So they were kind of an outlier, but they really enjoyed the assignment. So that's the range in story length. In addition to the collaborative writing, students also wrote individual reflection papers that asked them to explore specifically which linguistic features and literary devices they attended to in their fan fiction. So we did this both as part to help them become aware of the choices they were making through fan fiction writing and kind of deepen the learning experience by raising awareness. But this also served as a tool for collecting data to see what did they identify as having learned? So we could start to document what sort of skills did the students seem to develop when we brought fan fiction into the classroom. So that's what I'm going to focus on here. Examples mainly that come from their individual reflections. What we saw over all 6 years, regardless of the text that they did, was common reference to a shift or learning of new vocabulary. So these students in Sweden often were very proficient in conversational English. They were very comfortable, we might say, with contemporary English, but in many cases, they were not very comfortable with literary English. And this is what one student explained who was involved in the blogging Hobbit. This writing activity has influenced my language skills. During this project, I've been able to expand my repertoire of English words, which are not so commonly used in everyday English anymore. So for instance, because the Hobbit story itself is based in a fantasy world, the language there doesn't sound like early 21st century youth language. So the students, when they wanted to explain things, had to carefully go back to the text and see what words would fit in this universe. And one group explained in their story, they wanted to talk about a party, but they realized that the word party didn't seem to fit in the text. So they went back to see what could they say about party with drinks and snacks. So they ended up using words like feast instead of party. And instead of drinks and snacks to describe the food, they looked and used the language of the text, like mead for a drink, or lambas bread, which is a specific kind of food mentioned in this particular story. So these were examples of how they were using more literary and unusual, not everyday language. Another thing that happened that was quite interesting is their language was challenged by a choice that they started making that was very common in the digital wilds. And that is where fans will fuse things together. So they'll write a story, but they'll combine it with another story, or they'll combine it with something that they know. So this is kind of reappropriating it into a known context. And by the time we moved to the Sherlock Holmes stories, what we started to see students doing is retelling Sherlock Holmes mysteries, but situating them in Sweden. So this posed an interesting challenge. And here's an example of one of the stories written. It's called The Hound of the Northern Lights, and it's based on the well-known novel, The Hound of the Baskervilles. But in this particular story, they situated in Norrland, northern Sweden. And what that meant is the very British Holmes and Watson had to find themselves in northern Sweden, dealing with life up there in the very long nights in winter, having to drink coffee instead of tea. and having to negotiate the cultural norms and language while dealing with the Swedish police system. So they had to find a way to reconcile these very different discourse styles and see what would happen when you brought these British people into a very familiar context. So that was another challenge that many enjoyed. But another type of fusion that was also common posed an additional challenge for students, and that is fusing stories that have very different languages in them. So one very adventurous group of students wrote a story, they called it Nowhere to Hide, and it was a fusion of Sherlock Holmes, but the American 1960s, 1970s cartoon show, Scooby-Doo. You can see an illustration right here. And what they did is they reimagined Holmes and Watson as teenagers who were part of the Scooby Gang. And the student explained the reason why their group did that. My interest in Doyle and the Sherlock Holmes world is still at an intermediate level. On the other hand, my knowledge of the Scooby-Doo universe is far greater, and I could enter that verse much easier than the universe of Sherlock Holmes. So they were highly motivated because they got to put something in that they knew and liked in the assigned text. But the challenge they faced was, how do you merge or adapt the very Victorian English of Conan Doyle's Holmes and Watson to the very 1970s youth slang language of this cartoon show? And the students realized this was a particularly hard thing to do. How could they maintain these two universes and mix them together? So they had to make very strategic decisions about language, and they also recognized they weren't always very successful about it, but certainly they were very aware of these very different registers, we might say. Here we have another example of the language attention that students paid to, where they were really trying to capture the language of the original text so that their story felt like it was a Sherlock Holmes story. And this got to the level of phrasing and word order, and even the choice of specific words that, again, don't reflect the English they were regularly using. And I've highlighted some parts in yellow here. A student wrote, instead of saying he said, we in Doyle instead used said he. So we can see a shifting in the word order phrase. Down below, we see the same student says that Doyle's Sherlock Holmes often says pray instead of please, and I fancy instead of I believe, which we also used in our fan fiction. So this was good, but some students went beyond this and were aware that once they started using it in their fan fiction, it started to be used outside of the classroom as well. In fact, it started to influence their own English. Here's what one student had to say. First off, I'm highly Americanized in my English use, and I blame Hollywood. It has been a welcome challenge to write in British. My biggest inspiration has once again been the BBC show. I truly enjoyed using the word foggiest in a text, and it's now part of my vocabulary. So here we can see a student referencing that many of the students would also look at other versions of Sherlock Holmes to inspire their thinking. But all this exposure to British media was now introducing them to different slang words that they didn't normally use, but were now incorporating into their everyday English. And that was an interesting observation. We also had students talk about grammar aspects, and I want to share one that is a particularly unique. It only emerged with respect to the Harry Potter stories. And this student wrote, this project made me pay attention to grammatical aspects in the Harry Potter books. For example, Rowling doesn't use a lot of transitional words, which we just use a lot in academic writing, but rather she uses colons. I have never used colons before in my writing, so that was fun to learn. So this is a very interesting thing that at the level of attending to, for example, how to write dialogue or how to write longer sentences, the students became very aware that the norms for this type of writing, this creative writing, and this particular author were very different from what they'd been taught in their academic writing, where they'd been taught how to use conjunctive adverbs and certain very academic sounding transitional phrases like moreover. So this student learned to use colons. So that's a slice of what happened when we brought fan fiction to an advanced language classroom. But I'm often posed questions about what it's like at other levels. And especially when we think at the university level, and especially in an English teacher education program, you have people who are probably particularly interested in the stories that they're reading and writing and like learning English? What happens when you bring fan fiction tasks into a different context? And for this, we move a little further south to the town of Aalst in Flanders. And we look at what happens when we bring fan fiction tasks into the secondary school foreign language classroom. So this is work that I'm going to report on that was recently carried out with my colleagues who are part of the Fantails project, which is a European project that brought together secondary school teachers and university instructors who focused on the development of these teaching materials. I will be talking more about that afterwards. So in this particular class, we were looking at a final year course. So the students were in upper secondary school. There were 21 of them learning English as a foreign language, 17 to 18 years old. Their English level was slightly lower, we can see, than in the university class that I reported on from Malmö, most reporting at the B2 level. Again, in this course, they were also organized into collaborative writing groups to offer peer support with each other. The groups were smaller, usually 2 to 3 students. So there were a total of 8 groups in this class. Now, interestingly, they were not writing fan fiction based on a book. They did it based on a digital game. So the teacher worked with the students and they selected Assassin's Creed as their source text. That's an action-adventure video game that has narrative elements. And each version, there are many different Assassin's Creed storylines, but each version is set in a different time period and region. And for this course, the teacher made this into a multi-week assignment and dedicated approximately 25 classroom hours to this. And there's an additional element to this particular activity that brings in even more of the technology. The students weren't just writing fan fiction, they were putting it in the format of interactive fiction using the software Twine, which allows you for interactive storytelling. So here's an example of what I mean. Interactive storytelling is often a story with a choice. So you get to a point and then you go down one path and the story goes in one direction. If you choose a different path, the story has a very different outcome. And Twine is this type of application that allows you to put together these branching stories. So here's an excerpt of one of the stories, and you can see where the choice is highlighted in blue. This one is called Not About Pyramids, and it incorporated the setting of Assassin's Creed Black Flag and dealt with pirates. So you can see the story in white that they'd started writing, and then the 2 choices. The main character has to decide whether to attack, choice 1, or turn the ship around, and that's choice 2. So these are branching outcomes. So these are more complex storytelling activities, and some of the classroom time was dedicated to instruction on how to use Twine and put them together. So what happened when we spoke with these secondary school learners? Well, again, much like the university students, they also found it really challenged their vocabulary, and they identified the use of a lot of literary and descriptive vocabulary as being what they learned. So as one student said, I think the hard part was being creative and using an extensive vocabulary. What came out of this is that for many students, this was the first time they had done creative writing in any language. So they really had to dive deep for more descriptive words. Many of them commented on the nature of the assignment because it was an extensive, longer one, affected all their writing skills. This student says, it improved our writing skills because first, we never wrote such an extensive text, and now we did. And we did it descriptive, so it improved our writing skills. But perhaps my favorite quote is one that really gets at how this kind of creative writing was different than what we might think of in a lot of academic writing, in that it required the students to write something they perceived would be interesting to read. And to do that, they really had to think more carefully and adapt their sentence structures. So here's what one student said. I think that with the English, we had to pay attention to the structures of the sentences because it was very tempting to start every sentence with he. He did this, he did that, and then continue like that, or to just make very short sentences instead of kind of trying to build a decent, beautiful sentence that you would actually read in a book. So we can see here that the idea that they were writing fan fiction, something creative, but also something that was supposed to be enjoyable to read, pushed them to alternate and adapt to create longer sentences and greater sentence variety. So it pushed them at the level of complexity. not just with their vocabulary, but also grammar. So, as I said before, one of the questions I get are, what does this mean for other foreign language classrooms? It's great that you're doing it in your classroom, but what about others? So I want to share with you now the work that has come out of the Fantails project, where we, again, worked with colleagues and classes, not just in Belgium, but also in Sweden. And our third partner country was Germany, to see what happens and to adapt and create materials for the teaching of a fan fiction-based, multilingual, interactive storytelling. So here's the link. Everything I'm going to talk about will be available at the Fantails website. It is a, like I said, European project that is just completed, and it merges practices from fan fiction, interactive fiction, that branching storytelling that's common in gaming, and multilingualism to deliver technology-mediated storytelling tasks. So what we did is develop materials, test them out, receive input, not just from instructors, but also from learners. We started in English, but the materials were also developed in the 4 languages of the project. So that included German, Dutch, and Swedish. So we developed, for instance, storytelling prompts and rubrics. I'll share with you some examples, but these were sort of like the things, the assignments that you would give to a student. What are you writing about? What does this look like? We also developed a teacher handbook that includes things like sample lessons and more guidance on implementing the materials, and as well an online platform. This is a tool where teachers can go in and assemble digitally all these different prompts and rubrics and kind of pick and mix them together to develop assignments. You can give students access and kind of assign and grade them. You can also share your own materials that you develop for others. All of these are available at the link below. And this is, again, on the Fantails website, but specifically the page labeled materials. And you're welcome to use them. And I encourage you, if any of this is of interest to you, please go ahead. But I'm going to explain in a little more detail what these look like. So when I mentioned the storytelling prompts, the idea was, much like the students in Belgium, that you could mix the different pieces together. You could mix a fan fiction prompt with an interactive fiction prompt and a multilingualism fiction prompt to make a very complex task, or you could just have a simple one prompt task. So here's an example fan fiction prompt. We would give a definition and then a more specific example based on a story. And this is fusion. Fusion is the type of fan fiction that I've been talking about here. It's where 2 or more source texts are combined. For instance, in your story, you'll combine a fairy tale with another story, either a fairy tale or non-fairy tale. This is exactly a prompt that was used with another secondary school class we had in Belgium, who in fact did use fairy tales. But there are lots of, I think there are about 15 different fan fiction prompts because there are so many different kinds of, we might say, fan fiction genres. We also see, because multilingualism was a part of our project, a chance to mix things up by bringing in examples of how to make the story more multilingual. And here's an example of one that we provide based on, if you were to say, use something like Harry Potter. Somebody has cursed Harry Potter. He's no longer able to speak English. So to keep young Harry Potter safe and allow him a normal childhood, Dumbledore sent Hagrid to leave Harry with a Belgian wizard family, and Harry therefore never acquired English. So that's one such example. So again, you can find all of these materials, and we have just a book of prompts to read through that you can access on the Fantails site. But one other thing that teachers often raise and have concerns about is, how do you evaluate this? So in addition to the prompts, we also have assessment tools. This includes checklists, very detailed rubrics, but also peer assessment tools that teachers can adapt for fan fiction, multilingualism, and interactive fiction. So here you see an example of a teacher's checklist for fan fiction. And again, we're hoping, if people use this, that they take the elements that are relevant to their context and also adapt them. Another major question that comes up is, well, what about different levels of learners, or what about different languages? And so the handbook itself includes materials for people who are interested in that. So before we did our projects, and again, we created materials in the 4 languages of the projects, but what we found is really important is to find out what students are already interested in the language they are learning, or maybe would be interested in, right? So there are certain things that students are already reading. So we developed surveys for gathering information about potential source text, and these surveys are available in all 4 languages of the project, and they've been adapted for the different languages. So for instance, the Swedish survey acknowledges that many Swedes don't play digital games in Swedish, but they may use YouTube and watch YouTube videos and be interested in YouTube personalities. So that survey looks a little different than the English language one. We also include suggestions for adapting the materials for different levels of proficiency and different learner populations. We also provide additional classroom teaching ideas to help scaffold. Many students are not very familiar with creative writing at all. And you may have a multi-level class, for instance, with some students who really at a much more lower level of proficiency. So which tasks are easier, or how do you adapt them? And we include those suggestions, as well as suggestions for adapting the activities specifically for online teaching. So I'm going to wrap up here, and just a reminder, this is the website, once again, where you can locate all the materials I have been talking about. And I would like to acknowledge some of the art that you saw throughout this presentation was generously provided by a fan artist named Fox Estacado, and I want to thank her. And these are the references that I would like to provide for you to take a look at. But that's it, and I'm happy to start taking questions at this point.
Thank you so much, Shannon. First question from Cynthia Ed, qui a posé la question il y a longtemps. Oui,
All right.
J'ai franco-anglais. Voilà.
All right. I'm moving up to see which is the question. Oh, I see Alfred.
From Cynthia Ed.
Okay. Can you explain the transition between the 3 different stories and discords? Was it work during one year? Okay, all right. So the 3 different fan fiction projects that I described took place over 6 years. So what that means is they would only use the blogging Hobbit that was used in 2013 and 2014, right? So those were separate classes. So each course only had 1 text. And then the next time the course was offered, we either did the text a second time with new students, or we switched to a new text. So they only had 1 source text. I hope that answers the question that you meant about it was 1 text per semester. Cynthia had a follow-up question about, was the choice of these 3 different stories or registers, what was the purpose behind it? Okay, this is a really good one. The very first we wanted to select stories that had some relevance to the students, were familiar to the instructors, and were also things that were produced and had a big fandom behind them, so we could provide fan fiction examples. The reading I talked about that Steve Thorne and I did, we talk more in detail about why we selected those texts. So we selected the blogging Hobbit in the years that the Hobbit films were coming out, so that there was some popular thing going on outside the classroom that they could choose to do. When we went to the Sherlock Holmes stories, that overlapped with the BBC Sherlock series, but also the US-based elementary Sherlock Holmes television show, so that students could see versions in the popular media. And the Harry Potter book was, like I said, selected because many of our students were Harry Potter fans, and one of the instructors was. So it was easy to teach something that the instructors knew and that there was already a fan following. Not all texts are easy to turn into fan fiction. And so we wanted to use those where students could find models and we could share with them what this looked like. All right. How many more minutes do I have to answer questions? I don't want to go over time.
You have 10 minutes.
Oh, that's a lot. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. I see. Some people have been using Twine. Good.
There's Dana, Di Pardo, Léon, Henri, que je salue d'ailleurs.
All right. I see a question by Muriel, who asked, how do you assess such a fan fiction task? And so this is a really good question. And again, the rubrics that we developed from Fan Tales came out of the work that my colleagues and I in Malmö started doing. So we were assessing the fan fiction tasks in Malmö based on the requirements of the course. So there were specific curriculum goals that students had to meet. And one of them was the ability to analyze a literary text and point to specific literary devices. So what we recognized is in their reflection paper, it required them to go back and talk about the analysis they did in the text that they were writing fan fiction about. So they might have pointed to like foreshadowing that they had used and explained how they incorporated foreshadowing into their story. So you can see that was very much tied to the curriculum in which that specific project was embedded. My colleague in Belgium, though, again, he was working with a language class of upper secondary school students, and he was looking more at, you know, the level of language, the accuracy of language, as well as how well they actually adhered to the instructions. So if they were supposed to be telling a story based on Assassin's Creed, and it was supposed to have multiple branching decisions and be complete, this was part of it. One of the challenges many people face is creativity, because that's the other thing you look for in a story. So in the Fantails items, we tried to come up with breaking down how you might evaluate creativity. So part of it, the nature of fan fiction is that it's something new, but it's also based on something that exists. So it has to do both. So we ask, like, what elements of the source are clearly present in the new story, and what innovative things have been brought into the story. So we find that's a way of recognizing both the creativity, but also that it's still fan fiction and not just somebody writing whatever. So it is a challenge, and that's a really good question. Okay. I see a couple of questions that are talking about making students into it. I'm going to jump ahead to Christopher's question. He asks, how do you make a normal student, a low reader writer, a fan? Okay, so to be honest, not everyone is going to like the thing that we make them read. And I think this is true with any assignment you are requiring of students in a class. Some people love it. And this is, in fact, what did happen, is that as they got more involved in the thing that they were writing about, they started doing more research about it. And I did have people at the end of the course who were like, oh, wow, after reading The Hobbit, I've now started reading all of the Lord of the Rings novels just for fun. So the other novels by the same author. That was pretty overwhelming. But we also had students who were not fans. They didn't become fans, but they appreciated more what they were doing. And then, of course, we also had people who invariably prefer things like traditional grammar instruction and did not like creative writing in any way. So they didn't become fans. But what I'm going to answer a hidden part of your question, and I think part of it is, how do you get people interested enough to actually want to commit to the assignment? And that is something we struggled with the first 2 years. And that's why we changed these prompts to allow students to do some of the things they wanted to do. So that fusion example I gave you, it allowed our students to, like with the Scooby-Doo and Sherlock Holmes fusion, it allowed our students, even if they didn't like the thing that they were writing for us, there was something else that they liked, and we allowed them to bring that in. So we had a lot of fusions of, say, Sherlock Holmes and Game of Thrones, because we had people who were watching that. We had, again, people who would take stories like the Harry Potter stories or even the Sherlock Holmes stories and make them more Swedish. So they would situate them in Malmö, or they would write their classmates into them. So we allowed them to play. And I think that's a big part of fan fiction, is it's playfulness. It's creating something out of the familiar, and also sometimes writing yourself into the story. And so that's actually very powerful for younger learners. We heard our secondary school students really like the idea of writing themselves into the story. So when they were allowed to do that, they kind of had more fun. And I think that is also related to Catherine Janot's question about resistance, students who can't or won't enter the world of fan fiction. The obvious advantage teachers have in some cases is students usually don't want to fail the class. So even if they don't like the assignment, they will do it. But And when you have a class of 70 or 90 people, invariably there will be some in there who really struggle with the material. But what we found is by giving students a choice, so that they could, we still were reading Sherlock Holmes, but they could tell their story this way, or by the time we moved to Harry Potter, we gave them 4 choices. And that actually made it more enjoyable for them, to the point that students, some of them started drawing illustrations of their stories. We actually had one group who were very musically inclined, who performed a poem. They turned it into a song and performed it for the class. So what they started doing were the things that they liked. And this became more fun for them. And it was a hard project. It was a lot of work, but I think they found ownership over that. And the choice gave them a kind of autonomy, some degree of autonomy in deciding what they could do. I think that helped.
Last question, no?
Okay. It's hard to pick. These are good ones.
Very successful presentation.
Thank you. So there's a good question about having the teacher handbook translated into the other languages. So I do want to say the handbook itself is in English. We didn't receive funding to translate it, but portions of the handbook are in some other languages, and they are not in French, but there are elements in German. And like I said, some elements are in Swedish, German, and Dutch. So those are the other languages. And we invite people through our platform. If you join the platform and you translate and you share tasks there, we welcome that. So I wish we could have done more languages, but we were limited to what resources we had. Okay.
You have 2 minutes.
2 more minutes?
Yes. A lot of questions.
Okay. All right. So last one.
Yeah. Muriel Grosbois.
About the individual versus collective part?
Yeah.
Okay. So some people may wonder why we had students doing, or what would happen if we did individual fan fiction. And this is work I'm doing now, but haven't done research on it. I brought these same tasks here to the United States, where I'm having students who are teaching English, training to become English teachers. So they're not learning a foreign language. Most of them are not, some of them are. But the classes are much smaller. So they're given the option of either writing individually or writing collaboratively. And because they're at a high level of English already, it's not the same sort of challenge. And most of the students are choosing to write individually. But I've had some who've written collaboratively. And it's kind of nice to give them that option. I also found sometimes, of course, the collaborative writing can lead to conflict if the groups don't know each other that well. So that has been a challenge. And we've tried different configurations when we do the collaborative writing of allowing the students to work with people that they know and work well with. It doesn't always work though, because in the case of Sweden, this was one of the very first classes they took and they didn't know each other that well. So some groups worked fabulously, like the one that wrote 16,000 words. Other groups ended up breaking up into smaller groups because they didn't get along so well. So that was another challenge.
Okay, thank you so much, Shannon. It was very interesting, and thank you for answering all the questions.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much.